All right, we ready?
Yeah.
Okay, so we left off last class talking about the collapse and failure of, or rather, we didn't talk about the collapse yet. We talked about the weaknesses of the articles. Today we're going to talk about the collapse. Before we get into that, though, it is worth mentioning two of the only things that the articles managed to accomplish, and that is the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. There are two questions that have to be answered about all of that land that is west of Appalachia that many Americans want to settle. How will the new lands be divided up in the Ohio River Valley? And once they're settled, how will they apply for statehood? So I'm going to actually walk over to the map for this so it makes a little bit more sense. Most of all of this land here was claimed by a variety of different states. And as we know, states like Virginia, for example, and New York had large land claims. That was one way that Virginia was able to pay its war debt off quickly, was by issuing parcels of land out in Kentucky. Same thing, the Carolinas issue parcels of land out in Tennessee, and this helps get their war debt resolved, their war debt problems resolved relatively quickly. So what the articles are going to do, or at least Congress will do under the articles, is pass this first one called the Land Ordinance of 1785. They are going to take occupation of all of the Ohio territory. So this is basically like Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin. And they're going to have people go out, survey the land, create these townships, counties, parcel out land for public schools. If you ever watch an election, right, you might see Virginia zeroed in on an area that a candidate's winning an election, and then they might zero in on Ohio. And if you ever look at the way that the map looks, the counties in Ohio and the townships are very much gridded out, not perfectly, but they're surveyed out. Whereas in Virginia, like the little county I grew up in, looks like a little frying pan. Henrico kind of looks like a boomerang. Okay? That's how a lot of the counties look on the eastern seaboard, because a lot of those places were surveyed like during and after the colonial period, or prior to the end of the colonial period and before the early new nation. Whereas out here, we see this like parceled up by surveyors. All right. We have to keep in mind that in that land ordinance, Native Americans are totally left out of the equation. All right. This is where we start breaking these treaties, and Native Americans are totally forgotten about as settlers start to stream west. This is also the beginning of an era that we're going to head into in the not too distant future, and that's going to be the era of manifest destiny. We all familiar with that? Okay, so when we think about westward expansion, check it out. We often think about westward expansion all the way out here, but westward expansion has to start really here first for people heading out into the Ohio territory. The next phase of the law is called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Once 60,000 people settle in a territory like, say, Ohio, then they can write up a state constitution, send it to Congress, and wait for approval and ratification. Another interesting caveat here, slavery is completely barred in the Northwest Territory. No slavery allowed. However, slavery was permitted in these southern Trans-Appalachian states like Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. This is going to lead to a very bizarre and detrimental predicament. And that is, as states start to enter, they almost start to enter in pairs, meaning that one comes in as a free state, the other one comes in as a slave state. And we start this sort of precedent that we have to keep the slave and the free state numbers what? Balanced or equal. Is that going to be possible? No. And there are a lot of people that are worried about this because what is this ultimately going to lead us to? Civil war. Very good. All right? And that just goes back to the fact, whether people want to admit it or not, the American Civil War, foundation of that war, is rooted in the issue of slavery. We'll get to that as we move forward. So, any questions at all about these land ordinances? All right. So this is really the only major achievement that the Articles, or at least Congress, got done under the Articles of Confederation. This will have us give us a little bit better of an idea here. Ohio enters as a state in 1803, Indiana in 1816, Illinois in 1818, Michigan in 1837, Wisconsin in 1848, and Minnesota. Most of Minnesota was actually obtained through the Louisiana Purchase. And they become a state in 1858. So that's a little bit about the Northwest Territory. In the early years after the American Revolution, the new nation is struggling not only at home, but it's also struggling abroad. We're having a really difficult time trading with other countries because what is truly America's only commodity, even as the war comes to an end? Very good. Crops. Good. Tobacco, rice, corn, indigo. We are not yet part of the Industrial Revolution. That's going to take some time, all right? We're not capable of manufacturing goods on a large scale. And England wants to exploit that weakness, all right? So England refuses really to abolish its navigation laws. It does this really weird, the British merchants and shippers do this really weird thing where they'll ban trade and then they'll turn around and dump cheap products or surplus products and flood the American markets. They're constantly causing disruption in the marketplace. That's what led to Jay's Treaty. Also, Vermont is a problem. Now, that sounds kind of silly, right? Why would Vermont be a huge problem? Well, Vermont was actually disputed territory between both New York and New Hampshire. And before the American Revolution, King George III claimed that Vermont actually belonged to New York. But as the war dragged on, Britain was almost trying to convince Vermont to come over and become a province. But most of the people of Vermont, like Ethan Allen and Ira Allen, leaders of the Green Mountain Boys, who we learned about in the Revolution, had served on the Patriot side. So Vermont was kind of in limbo for a while. They're kind of like their own country for about 14 years. And they basically give Congress an ultimatum. If you're not going to ratify us as a state and allow us to enter as a state, we're going to have no choice but to go to Britain to become a province. And the last thing they wanted to do was lose Vermont. So that's how Vermont ends up becoming the 14th state And that actually does open up the door for, like, at least the process of bringing new states in for statehood through the creation of the early new nation. Britain also continued to hold forts out on the frontier. Most of their forts were in Canada, but some of them were out in the Ohio Valley and in the Mississippi River Valley. And what they're doing out west is they're supplying Native Americans with weapons to launch attacks on settlers. This is actually going to be one of the issues that will take us into the War of 1812. We'll be dealing with that when we get into lesson 8. We owe how many countries, or what main countries do we owe debt to? France, Spain, and Holland. Very good. Well, Spain shuts off trade along the Mississippi and prevents access to New Orleans, even though it's controlled by France at the time. Both Spain and England are stirring the pot by aiding Native Americans on the frontier. Ultimately, the Pinckney Treaty that we learned about earlier will help resolve some of those issues. France and the Dutch want their money back for the loans that they had provided for the war. And then there's also another problem. American merchants are dealing with pirates in the Mediterranean, mainly from the Ottoman Empire. What do we not have right now? We don't have a navy. We don't even have an army, okay? So we're getting picked on the open seas. There's no real freedom of the open seas for America. And that will ultimately lead to the push for not only the creation of a standing army, the creation of a standing Marine Corps, but also the creation of a standing Navy. We're going to talk more about this as we move forward. This is often referred to as the Barbary Wars. These are the wars fought between America and the Barbary pirates in the Mediterranean. Do I have any Marine Corps families out there? Anybody tied to the Marine Corps? The Marine Corps battle hymn, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Right? The halls of Montezuma refer to the Mexican War, which we'll learn about in lesson 9. But the shores of Tripoli are in reference to the Barbary pirates. Sorry, my singing is horrible. So we'll talk more about them as we move forward. This is actually a really famous piece of American artwork by Dennis Malone Carter. Decatur boarding the Tripolian gunboat. That's Stephen Decatur. We're going to talk about him. He's a hero of the War of 1812. Most of the American sailors that are serving early on are coming in totally on a voluntary basis. Same thing with the early American Marines. And we'll talk more about the buildup of the American, or the rebuilding of the American military in the early new nation. Questions up to this point? Am I going too fast or pretty good pace? All right. This is arguably one of the most important, if not the most important thing we're going to cover today, and that is Shays' Rebellion. If we bumped into somebody on the street and asked them, tell me a little bit about Shays' Rebellion, they look at us like we're crazy. But they shouldn't. This is an event that everyone should know. Now, if we grew up in Massachusetts, we probably all would know it. Like the way Jamestown has been seared into our brains our entire lives, this rebellion has been a big part of Massachusetts history. What makes this event so important is because this is what brings an end to the Articles and leads to the Constitution. This is kind of like a final straw. So I'm going to explain who this guy is and why this event is important. Daniel Shays is a unique individual in the post-revolutionary era. But his situation is all too common. Shays served from the beginning of the war all the way to the end. I'm talking like Bunker and Breeds Hill all the way to Yorktown. Served with such honor and valor that he was actually presented with a sword by Marquis de Lafayette. It was like his most prized possession. Like most patriots, what do you think his profession was? Like most of them. He's a farmer. Okay? That's not a bad guess, though. He is a farmer. So he goes home to Massachusetts to return to his farm. He gets back home. Not only does he owe mortgage payments on the farm, but he also owes what on the farm? Taxes. Very good. All right? He doesn't have any money. Because what has he done for the last 7 years? Fought. Should he be paid for his service? Yeah. Of course he should. That's why he kept signing up over and over and over again, was to be paid. But why has he not been paid? Because there's no money. All right? Often in America, we always say, oh, we've treated our veterans so horribly since Vietnam. No, we have treated our veterans horribly since the beginning. This is a really good lesson to learn of how we should always, regardless of the situation, those who are willing to fight for and defend the nation, deserve to be paid and respected. Well, from the start, this was a problem that Revolutionary War veterans faced. They didn't get their back pay. So he has no way to cover the cost of all this. He sells the sword. He sells all his possessions. It's still not enough. And he's not the only person this is happening to. Thousands of former veteran patriots are having their farms and land foreclosed upon because they can't pay their mortgage or they can't pay the taxes. So Shays and a large group of veterans rise up in Massachusetts, shut down the courts, block the debtors' prisons, and their plan is to march on Springfield, Massachusetts to arm themselves and burn Boston to the ground. However, who's going to stop them? There's no what? There's no army. So a group of wealthy merchants in Boston raised an independent force. But the people that they paid to fight Shays were veterans of the American Revolution. So this is a fight, neighbor against neighbor, cousin against cousin, and in some cases, brother against brother. This could have ultimately led to a what? A full-on civil war. But the rebellion was put down. Shays and his, I think they lost like 4 people were killed and I think like over 20 were injured in a handful of battles. It started in the summer of 1786 and ended in the early to mid-January of 1787. Once this whole thing was over with, they end up pardoning him. It was kind of hard to get this guy for what? Treason, right? It's kind of hard to get him for treason. Like, is he a traitor? He's obviously created quite a stir and a pretty substantial rebellion. So what delegates decide to do, members of Congress, they decide that they're going to meet in Annapolis, Maryland, to try to figure out how to resolve some of these issues. Notably, the commerce and debt problem. That's the main focus of the meeting in Annapolis that they go to. But ultimately, their meeting is going to wind up, the major meeting that they have is going to wind up being held in the summer in Philadelphia. So, this is a very famous piece of American folk art. This is a wood etching from Shays Rebellion. On the left is Daniel Shays. On the right, Job Shattuck. And this was published in the Boston Almanac in 1787. Awesome. Are we good? Any questions about Shays? Do y'all know what I mean by being pardoned? It's basically like forgiven for the rebellion. There's no execution that's going to happen here. No jail time. So, the initial meeting in Annapolis does not go as well as everyone thought it would go because only 5 states showed up with delegates. They did talk about the commerce problem. One of the big commerce problems was that, like, a state like Virginia could levy a tax on their what? Very good. And if it crosses over to a foreign country or even to another state, we would call it a what? Tariff. Very good. Tariff is a word that's going to stay with us for the rest of the year. So, tobacco, they were levying tariffs on tobacco, but it got to be so ridiculous that, like, people producing eggs in Rhode Island were putting tariffs on their eggs going to Connecticut. It was getting a little silly. And no one could control it, and there's also no common currency. It's just a disaster. So they decided to meet in the summer, actually the late spring of 1787 in Philadelphia, right back at Independence Hall, where they had debated and signed the Declaration of Independence. 12 states sent representatives. Rhode Island did not. They were a little leery about all this. And the goal initially was just to revise the articles. That's obviously not going to happen. They're just going to throw the whole thing out. All right? So some of the political all-stars involved in the convention. Alexander Hamilton. What is his main goal here? The debt. Very good. The debt crisis. Hamilton is consumed with the debt issue. And he's going to lay out his idea of a national banking system, a treasury. This is actually going to ultimately lead to one of the most important things Hamilton ever produced. It's called the Report on Public Credit, which we'll talk about that later. All right? Ben Franklin. Franklin is in his 80s at this point. To get to your 80s in this era was quite the feat. Franklin does a lot of compromise during this. He's also one of the leading advocates to abolish slavery. There is a contingent in this convention that want to abolish slavery. Actually, one very interesting person in the convention from Virginia that's pushing for the abolition of slavery is George Mason, who he himself is a slaveholder. So you're getting a lot of different people from sort of all over the place that are wanting to bring the institution of slavery to an end. George Washington, he's going to be chosen as chairman, obviously, right? Why not? What's he got going for him? Yeah, he won the war, and after the war was over, what did he do with the army? He disbands it, right? He's the American Cincinnatus. There's another reason why he's chosen, or a variety of other reasons that we'll talk about that later. Arguably, the most important person here is a very soft-spoken, brilliant lawyer from Virginia, James Madison. Madison is a brilliant political mind. He is going to show up with a plan to totally dismantle the Articles of Confederation. Madison will also keep detailed notes. That is like our historical record that we have of the convention laid out by Madison, and then he goes on after the fact to author the Bill of Rights. That is why we often refer to James Madison as the father of the Constitution. Okay? And then, of course, Roger Sherman, who we briefly talked about before, and I said, when we talked about him helping write the Declaration of Independence, I said, we're going to talk more about him when we get to the constitutional era. Well, now here we are. He is going to author what is called the Great Compromise, also known as the Connecticut Compromise, that will create our two-house legislature, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Okay? People that aren't there: Thomas Jefferson, Minister to France; John Adams, Minister to England. Both of them were very upset that they were not in attendance. Sam Adams, kind of an interesting story. He refused to attend, but over time, he begins to agree that the Constitution is the right move, and he is going to help sway the vote for the ratification of the Constitution in Massachusetts. Thomas Paine, on his way to France, to ultimately get tangled up in the French Revolution. John Hancock refused to attend, would be line up in that group that we would refer to as the Anti-Federalists. And then, of course, Patrick Henry, one of the key leaders of the Anti-Federalists, refused to attend and famously declared, "I smell a rat." Why would some of these guys be skeptical of this? What do they think? What type of government do they think might be created here? Very good. It might just become a monarchy, and then they'll be right back to where they were. Excellent job. All right? Obviously, that's not going to be the case. But it feels that way. Especially, it's really interesting when you think about it. Like, the most monarchical mind here of the entire group that you're looking at is going to be Hamilton. Hamilton's like, let's get a king for life or a president for life. He's basically proposing the use of the British banking system, which we will adopt. So really great book recommendation for you guys is a book called Founding Brothers by Joseph J. Ellis. It won the Pulitzer Prize in 2001 for best nonfiction. And what it does is each chapter deals with a different vignette of this era. And it starts with the Constitutional Convention and it ends with the death of Hamilton and the duel with Burr. It's a really solid book, worth your time. So some of the main people that we're going to be dealing with in this lesson in 8, Washington, Madison, Jefferson, Hamilton, and John Adams. Even though these two are out of country right now, they're going to be playing a really important role heading into the early new nation. This is a really great place for us to stop. 55 delegates that were here, pretty well off, what we would call well-read, well-bred, and well-fed. Okay? Most of them had a college education. Many of them had served in the war. Many of them had served in Congress. And nearly all of them had served in some capacity in their state legislature, or they had served in a colonial legislature prior to the Revolution. They want to protect American democracy against their foreign enemies. They also want to protect and preserve American democracy at home. However, not all of them trust the common man. They do not trust the rabble. They don't want Shays' rebellion to continue happening over and over and over again, because if it does, it's all just going to fall apart. What they don't realize, though, is they're setting us up for a civil war. And we'll talk about that as we move forward. The Virginia delegation comes into this heavily prepared and with an agenda. And that agenda is to totally upend the Articles, which they'll get. In fact, Virginia's plan, that's what it's called, the Virginia plan, is going to replace the Articles and become the entire framework of the Constitution. We know why Washington was chosen. He won the war, but he's respected by most of the people there, if not all of the people there. I'm sure there were plenty of delegates that had some issues with him being chosen as chairman because there were a lot of egos in the room. But he commands respect. He also, in this, plays basically the job of referee. Okay? He's not a compromiser. He's not a debater. He's just trying to keep it all together, which he does. They're going to meet in secret for the entirety of the summer. Blistering hot, Independence Hall. Even though this isn't signed until September 17th, 1781, who still has to approve it? More than just him. The states. That is what makes this revolutionary, crew. 55 people from 12 states are changing the government of 2.5 million. Beautiful. That's revolutionary. That's all I've got today. All right? We're going to get into the convention when I see you next class. Here are some of the major players. Washington is chairman. James Madison, father of the Constitution. Ben Franklin, one of our lead compromisers. Hamilton, pushing for the assumption of state debts. And Roger Sherman, author of the Great Compromise. Questions for me? Awesome. Very good. Okay, so that's where we're going to pump the brakes.